Good morning, David.
Good morning, Salim.
How do we manage risk on projects that use an agile or adaptive approach?
Agile projects, there's a new approach to managing projects called agile or adaptive or incremental, which has been developed maybe in the last 10 years or so, maybe 15 years, which is quite widely used in some countries and in some industries, and other countries are not so familiar with it. The idea is that a traditional project life cycle has phases where you complete one phase before you start the next. So you have a project scoping or planning phase. Then you would have a design phase where you develop a solution. Then you might have an execution phase where you put the design into practice and you actually build something. Then you would have a test and acceptance phase, and then a delivery. And so this is called a waterfall life cycle. You start with an idea, then you have a plan, then you have a design, an execution, a test and acceptance, delivery. And you don't do the last one until you've done the one before. So that's the traditional waterfall approach. The agile approach says maybe we should be looking at the product a little bit sooner than the very end. Maybe we should be doing part of the design and development and then just checking that what we're doing is okay. So you have an incremental approach. You have a small cycle of planning, design, development, and a small delivery of some of the functionality, which you can then give to a user or to a client and say, this isn't the final thing, but it's part of the solution. Are we going in the right direction? And they say, this is okay, I don't like this. So then in the next phase, you take that feedback and you do a little bit more design, a little bit more development, and produce a second version, which has more functionality. You give that to your client or to your user and say, are we still going right? And he says, yeah, this is much better, carry on like this. So we do another iteration, another loop, and produce something else. And then you're adjusting as you go through. So the idea of agile or adaptive is we have some flexibility in the process. We don't go all the way through, come to the end, give it to the client, and he says, actually, that's not quite right. That's not what I want.
Then you'll be forced to start again.
Start again or have some rework, which is often very expensive. So agile delivery is like that. Now, often risk management on projects follows this kind of waterfall life cycle, which says, well, we'll do risk management in the planning, and then once we have a plan, we'll manage the risks within the plan during the execution phase. And then at the end of the project, all the risks are gone because we've delivered something. So if we're in one of these agile projects with a quick loop and a quick delivery, and then a bit of an adjustment and another quick loop and a delivery, and then another, how do we do risk management? And some people who are in the agile world, who use agile methodologies, will say, oh, we don't need formal risk management, because the whole idea of the agile approach is to reduce risk.
Exactly, yes.
So what we're doing is going to the client early with part of the solution and saying, are we okay? And when they say, no, we need to change this, you're removing the risk of delivering something at the end that isn't what's wanted. So the whole agile approach is a risk reduction method, they say. So we don't need risk management. Now, I would disagree with this for two reasons. First of all, in the agile approach, what they ask you to do, what you try to do, is to deal with the most risky part of the project or the functionality first. So the first loop is to take the high-risk elements and deal with those and go to the client with the things that are most uncertain and say, let's get an indication from you if these most uncertain parts are about right. And once we've got those right, then we take the next most risky parts, and then we leave the easy stuff to the end. Well, my first question is, how do you know which are the most risky parts? So if Agile is supposed to start with the high-risk elements, you need to have a way of telling which are the high-risk elements, which means you need to do a risk assessment. So there should be some way when you're building the content of the first loop and the second loop and the third loop, part of compiling the content of each iteration, each loop, should be a risk assessment which says, how do we know which are the most risky elements? Let's pick these high-risk ones to put them in here. So the first place that risk management is needed in an agile methodology is in putting together the content of each of these loops or iterations. Then when we've actually got that content and we have a quick loop, we're going to spend maybe 2 weeks or 1 month producing this first interim output. We need to manage the risk within that particular loop to say, well, let's deliver this in this short time with this functionality. So we need risk management in an agile or adaptive approach in 2 ways. One is in defining the content of each iteration, and the other is in managing that particular iteration to make sure it delivers. Now, if the iteration is only, let's say, 2 weeks long, and often that's the case in a rapid software development, for example, we don't have time to spend half a day or a day on a risk management process. So that means that risk management within each of these short loops needs to be very fast, very efficient. And we can do that because you'll remember we've said the risk process is based around a framework of a few simple questions. And so we can use those questions right at the beginning of our loop, and maybe we could use them every day as we're going through the loop, but certainly we could use them 2 or 3 times to just say, for this particular loop, this particular iteration, what are we trying to achieve? What might affect me? Which are the big risks and what should we do? Now let's do it. And so the simple question-based approach is very powerful within an agile methodology.
But with this adaptive way of managing risk, is there any possibility of new risk which can come between the loops itself? You have finished this loop, you move to the next one.
Yes.
What is in between?
Yes, of course. And so at the end of a loop, you produce an interim output which goes to the client or to the user and says, you know, are we going in the right direction? And of course, at that point, they can introduce new requirements or changes which have risks associated with them. So as part of building the next loop, we need to do the risk assessment that says now which are the high risk elements and use that information when we build the content of our second loop round. So yes, risk management is still important within these other methodologies, these other approaches which are less rigid and structured. You do all your design and all your execution, all your testing in one go. This quick approach still is risky, and the risk needs to be managed, but we do it in a slightly different way, a much quicker way within the loops because we don't have so much time, but we're still using the same basic risk management process.
Still, agile approach can be used also in programs.
Yes, it can be used in all sorts of different implementation areas. You can have an agile strategy development where, you know, at the most senior level of the organization, we have a kind of trial strategy, and instead of setting the strategy for 2 years or 5 years, we set it for 3 months. We run it for 3 months, and then we stop and we go to the board or to the senior leadership team, and we say, are we going in the right direction or do we need to change direction? And now you'll find strategy is much more flexible and updated more frequently, and not having a 2-year plan or a 5-year plan, but we're actually looking at having quicker loops or iterations of strategy development because the world is more volatile and changing. But obviously here in this section we're talking about risk in projects.
So can we say in brief that agile approach is a type of self-assessment within a process or within a project, or during the life cycle of the project?
It is a way of structuring the life cycle of the project, which allows the riskiness of the overall project itself to be developed, to be assessed and managed more frequently because of the frequency of these loops as we go through the life cycle, yes.
Thank you very much, David.
It's a pleasure.